A while ago, I made a series of videos on Reaper for game audio, and you can see the whole playlist of that right here. Those videos are just as relevant today as they were when they were first filmed, but it's a lot to go through if you just want to get up and use Reaper super quickly. So to help people dive into how to use Reaper for game audio as quickly as possible, we have this video right here. And considering a lot of students coming into my online courses want to start using Reaper for their sound design work, I'm also using this as kind of a companion. So if you're jumping into one of those and you want to use Reaper to do your online course work with me, then go ahead, watch this, and you'll be set and ready to go right away. Now, a few caveats before we dive in. Number one, I'm already assuming you know a little bit on how to use a DAW. Maybe you're coming from Logic or Pro Tools or even Reaper, but I'm assuming you know some basics of digital audio. If you know what a track is and what a WAV file is, you're fine. Number two, this is a pretty quick tour. It's not going to be super in-depth, it's just going to get you up and running and going as fast as possible. And number three, even though I'm using Reaper 7, the latest version for this is pretty backwards compatible, and any features that I mentioned that are Reaper 7 specific, I'll be sure to call out. Alright, so let's jump over to the computer and get into it. Alright. Here we are in Reaper, and let's dive right into it. Now, the first thing that you need to learn is themes. This is the most important topic in Reaper because everyone asks me about it, so it must be the most important way to get good at audio. Now, if you want to change how Reaper looks, all you need to do is go to Options, Themes. You can go online and search for themes, and all you do is download a zip file, drag it on top of the project, and boom, your theme changes. The one I'm using is called Smooth 6, but they're all good. All right, now that themes are out of the way and it looks real pretty, let's go into your settings because that's probably the second most important thing. First thing I want you to do is just go to Reaper and Settings. And this will be a little different on Windows, but you get the point. Now, I want you to go to this tab called Backups because this is where you can set up your autosaves. There's a ton of other stuff I recommend you look into, but this is the first thing. Go to Backups, turn on Autosave, and save autosaved project backups to an autosaves project subdirectory. So this will basically put your autosaves into a different folder. And then you can choose how often that your autosaves will happen. I have it set up to every 1 minute. And you can also limit the amount of autosaves that you have so it doesn't take up tons of room. Totally up to you. Okay, next up, there are more settings to change. What I want you to do is go to File and then go to Project Settings. So once you go to project settings, you'll see a bunch of different tabs. You can, of course, change the default time stretch and the default sample rate and all that sort of stuff. But what I want you to do is go to the media tab, and you'll see a line here, a blank space here that says path to save media files. So basically when you drag in a file or a video or something like that, it'll make a subfolder and it'll copy that media file over into that folder. So long as you have on import of media files to project, you have copy media to project path selected here. Now, when you do this, it means that anytime you drag in a WAV file or something from somewhere else on your computer, it'll also make a copy of that file into this project folder. And this is really important because if you are taking this project from one computer to another, or for some reason one of your files gets deleted or something like that, it's okay because it is all preserved within this project folder. So it is kind of independent of all the other files on your computer. So if you drag something in from somewhere else, you'll still be safe because it lives within your folder. Be sure to look around as well at these other settings because there's tons of good ones. But for now, this is all we're going to set. Now, the next thing to do is download an extension. Now, an extension is something that basically enhances Reaper's functions, and there's a trillion of them out there. But one of the most important is called SWS extensions. So you can see that up here, SWS extension, and I'll show you the website down in the description below. But basically, when you use SWS extension, it gives you a ton of features and shortcuts and options as well. So if I open up my shortcuts menu here, and I'll show you how to do that in a second, and just type in SWS, you'll see all these extra shortcuts that it provides for you, all this functionality. Most of it I'm not even using, but the little bit that I do use is very important. So it adds just a little bit of extra functionality, or quite a bit, and it means that you are able to do a lot more with Reaper, and it's completely free. There's literally no reason not to have this. This should be just included with Reaper by default. Now, I did open up this little shortcuts window right here. It's called Actions in Reaper. And the way you do that is you just go to Actions and Show Action List. By default, it's set to question mark. So if I hit shift and /, it brings this up. And this is where you can set your shortcuts. Now there's a lot to this. You can even make custom shortcuts. You can make macros, which are basically mixes of different shortcuts. So multiple things can happen at once. But basically all you need to do, go in here, search for stuff, and then you can basically set your shortcuts to whatever it is you want. There's no default. It's not like Pro Tools where there's kind of an industry standard default shortcut list. This is super customizable, and you can bring this around with you to basically any Reaper setup that you're using. And if you're moving to a new computer or anything like that, you can totally just take these shortcuts, export them, and then you can take those shortcuts and use them on a new computer as well. Now, the next thing I want to show you is the Media Explorer, and this is basically where you set up all your sound libraries. You don't have to use this. You can use a third-party app, but I like using the one that's built into Reaper. So in my actions list, I just type in Media Explorer, and you want to set up a shortcut for Show Hide Media Explorer. Mine is Option-Shift-M. You can make it whatever you want, but Option-Shift-M, boom, here are all my sound effects libraries right here, and you can just click and drag and put them into your project. Boom, just like that. Now, if you want to add a new library to this, you'll probably see nothing on your left-hand side. You'll probably just see a gray or white box. All you need to do is right-click in this gray or white or whatever area, and then say, Create New Database. So I'll just call this Tutorial, for example. And you'll see it's just called Tutorial. You right-click that new database, basically a collection of files, and then say, Add Path to Database. And basically then you just navigate on your computer, find what folder your sounds live in, hit open, and it'll import them all. And the nice thing is it won't import any non-Reaper related files. So you're not going to see things that aren't really relevant to you working. You're not going to see documents or anything like that pop up. So I basically just import an entire sound effects folder. Everything's nice and sorted, and then you can search within that. So for example, I can go to my sound effects database here. I can type in fire, and boom, there's all my fire sound effects. But a really cool thing is you can have operators as well. So I can say fire and ball. So anything that has fire and ball in the name, then it'll pop right up. So all my fireballs will pop up. Or I can say fire or ball. And basically this means that anything that has the word fire or the word ball in it will pop right up. And you can do all sorts of different kind of operators like this. I can even do fire not ball. So it'll just show me the sounds that have fire in them, but without the word ball. So there's all sorts of different ways you can use this, but just make sure your little operators, the and, or not, are in all caps. Okay, now if I want to take some of these sound effects and put them on different tracks, I can just click and drag, and they'll pop right up, and it'll make a new track for that sound that I'm dragging in. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that Reaper doesn't work the same as every other DAW in that there's no pencil tool or anything like that. Basically, everything is done with right-click to drag and highlight and left-click to kind of select time. And a lot of other stuff is done with different shortcuts. It's not like Logic in that you choose the pencil tool or the razor tool or different things like that. It works just a little bit differently. But if I just click and drag, and you'll see all these files move just like you'd expect, I can right-click and drag, and it'll highlight a bunch at once. Nothing too crazy there. If I want to add effects to these different tracks, there's a few different ways. One is depending on your theme, it might look a little bit different. But if I click on this little section that says FX, again, it might look different for you, but I'll click FX, and it'll pop up this little window. Now, what I can do is I can type in, let's say, compressor. And here are all my compressors, most of which I never use. But let's add this little R compressor on here. And boom, there's an effect. Now you'll see this little effect window pop up, and I can close it down. And if I want to bring it back up, I can just click that effects button again. And you can always add more effects to this chain. So I can right click, I can click add effects. And then I'll add like a reverb, let's say. Sure, let's do this one. Great. So now I have a compressor and a reverb. And you can always right click and add, or you can hit this add button down here. There are a million different ways to do it, but that's the most straightforward. The other way to do this is actually to look at your mixer. Now I recommend you set up a shortcut for this. So if I go to my actions and I just type in mixer, you'll see if I scroll down, you'll see toggle mixer visible. So if I hit X, there's my mixer. And nothing crazy here. You'll see my different effects on this track that I set up. And if I drag these effects to different tracks, it'll just copy paste them, which is nice. Or if I option click, if I hold down Option or Alt if you're on a PC, it'll move them. Instead of copying and pasting, it'll actually move that effect. But just like before, I can click any one of these and it'll pop them right up where I can change them. Now, one Reaper 7 specific feature that I want to show you that's really, really cool is if I open up any one of these effects windows, you'll see my two effects. You'll see a compressor and a reverb right here. What you can do is right click them. So I'll right click this reverb and then I will say, run selected FX in parallel with previous FX. And you'll see this two lines pop up next to that effect. And you can also see that on the mixer down here, these two straight up and down lines. Basically, this means it's running in parallel with the previous sound or with the previous effect. What this means is that instead of this sound being compressed and then sent to the reverb, so it would be reverberating a compressed sound because the order does matter. It basically goes in a chain from top to bottom. Instead, when our effects are parallel, basically our signal is being split and both of these plugins are acting on that dry signal at the same time. So it's compressing it and reverberating it differently from one another in two separate sounds, basically two separate streams. And then I'll come back and combine them both together. So instead of compressing it and then sending it to reverb, it's basically sending it to both of these effects at the same time. Gives a bit of a different effect. You can play around with this. You can play with the dry wet knob. It's a little more advanced, but we can go into it in a future video. Now let's get into exporting your sounds. So something to keep in mind is that there's a million different ways to export your sounds. I have ways I prefer. I use some plugins, but here's the kind of way I recommend you start thinking about in terms of game audio. So something that Reaper has, which is really nice, and that a few other DAWs have as well, is what are known as regions. And regions are basically lengths of time that we can set up to help export our sounds with. So one thing I recommend you do is set up a shortcut for this because it's a big pain if you don't. So here's what I'm going to recommend you do. This is how we can make a custom shortcut. And I have this one called Insert Marker with Selection. So basically, when I hit Option-Shift-C, here's what happens. I'll select one of my files. So I'll select this green one at the top. I'll hit Option-Shift-C. And basically, it'll make a region. You can see this kind of green section at the top, and it'll ask me to name it. So let's say I'll call it like Sound 1. Great. So now it makes this region called Sound 1. And now basically what I can do is take this and export Sound 1. And I can make a different region for this and call it Sound 2. And now I can export Sound 1 and Sound 2 separately from one another. So I don't have to rebounce the entire project. I can just export each of these regions individually. So I'll call this Sound 3, and here we go. So we can export each of these three different regions. Now, let me show you how to set this up. Basically, when you go to your actions, so for me, it's Shift / or question mark, you can find this basically macro here. It's a bunch of different shortcuts put together. You can see it's custom, so you won't actually see it by default. You'll have to make this yourself. But here's how you do that. Now, if you want to make a new shortcut, you just have to click New Action. But I'll show you what this one is already. So I'll click Edit Action. And basically, it'll show up this Edit Custom Action window. And basically, what you can do is take actions that already exist. You can see there's a ton of them. And you can drag them into this right-hand section here. And basically what will happen is that when you press this shortcut, when you trigger this action, it'll do all of these different things in order really, really fast, one after the other. Which is really, really nice because that means you can have a bunch of different shortcuts activate all at once if you do something over and over. So what I have set up here is time selection, set time selection to items. So basically, any item that is selected, any piece of audio or MIDI or anything like that that's selected, it'll move the markers so it'll highlight that zone with our little time selector. So it'll basically do that. Next, it'll say markers, insert region from selected items, so from this selected item, and edit. So basically, it'll take the selected item and it'll edit it. So when I hit Shift-Option-C, the edit means that it's basically going to give us the option to name it. Now, there's a billion different ways to do this. You might find a more efficient way or way that you like to do more, but this is the way I like to do it, and this is a good way to kind of start. Now, there are other more advanced ways to export, but this is all we're going to hit on for now. Now, there's one last thing you need to kind of learn when it comes to exporting these sounds, and that's something called the region render matrix. And let me show you what that is. But if I type in region render matrix, you'll see that there is an action called show region render matrix window. Now, this is set to Command-Shift-R. I recommend you set this to something because you're probably going to be using it a lot. But basically, I'll hit Command-Shift-R, and you'll see this somewhat confusing menu pop up. But basically what it's showing is we have our 3 regions, sound 1, sound 2, and sound 3. And basically what this is doing is saying like, okay, here are your 3 regions, here are your 3 kind of selections of time, essentially. What do you want to export with those? So for example, this very top box over here, these 3 kind of squares that you'll see here, this is basically exporting from the master track. So like export everything that is in this kind of time selection. So for example, if I drag this second sound here, it'll basically export everything that's going out to the master track all at once, putting that into a final sound. Whereas in this case, they are in separate kind of time positions. So if I export from the master track here, it'll only export this file on its own if I choose sound 1. Or in this case, sound 2, it'll export just this sound. And sound 3, it'll export just this sound. But if any of them are piled on top of one another, and I export a region, which is what I would do with a layered sound, it'll export this region of time from the master track, regardless of what's kind of on there. But if, let's say, I want to export stems, so individual tracks separately from one another, I can go to that same region, let's say sound 1, so this region here, and I can just click these 2 different boxes here. So basically, it's just going to export the first track from sound 1 and the second track from sound 1. So basically it'll make 2 separate files when I export this, meaning that I'll get 2 separate files and they won't interact with each other because I'm not exporting from the master track. But I can export as much as I want. I can click this all tracks and it'll export just the individual stems, the individual files from each of those. So it won't be all combined together. I'll just get the individual files. Or I can just hit master and unselect all that and it'll export everything from the master. It'll just be one file all combined together based on this region of time. So I'll just undo some of this, or I'll just move this guy back. Just hit Command Z a whole bunch. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to export each of these 3 sounds just from the master track just to show you. And then what we need to do is go to File and Render. And you can make a shortcut for this, of course. But when you open this up, you'll see a lot of different stuff. But the thing you need to know for this style of exporting is you'll see an option called Source. The first thing you need to do is set your source to region render matrix. So if I choose that, basically it'll say, okay, I'm going to export based off of what you have selected here. Great. And you can see here it says 3 regions. So it'll be 1, 2, and 3. And then what we want to do, or what a good idea to do is to make the file name based off of the region. So we have sound 1, sound 2, and sound 3. So for example, if I want to export each of those and have them be named properly, I can do what's called a wildcard. And a wildcard will basically automatically name the file based on certain parameters that I set up. So I hit wildcards, and then you'll see a ton of different options. But one thing that I like to choose is region. So you'll see this $ and region. So basically what this means is that the file will be named whatever the region is named. And then you can choose where you want it to go. So let's put it in the audio folder of here. Or what I can also do is I can choose the directory that we're currently in, this project. I can make a new folder called bounces. So I can just hit / type in bounces and it'll make a new folder for me, which is really nice. So now I can just put that in here for all my final files, all my exported files. Choose my sample rate. Do I want stereo or mono or surround or anything like that? We won't kind of go into sync interpolation or anything like that. But then you can choose your output format. So you can choose wave and a whole bunch of others. And what's nice is you can choose a secondary output format as well. So for example, you can set it up so that you're exporting audio and a video. So maybe you want to export audio so that it is able to be implemented into a game, but you're also exporting it to video so that people can look at whatever it is you're making and see it as a reference, because maybe you captured some gameplay video or a scene of a film and you are basically just showing the director or your boss or whoever, the client, here's what I have, here's what I made, here it is with video. So you can have kind of both exported at once, or with secondary output format. You can always choose no secondary output format and just have it export as WAV. And then you just hit render 3 files. So I'll just hit that, just hit render. It'll export all these files. And then I can just click open folder and you'll see sound 1, sound 2, and sound 3. Now, the last thing I want to show you is something called subprojects. Now, I've mentioned this before in other videos, but subprojects are so good for Reaper. Now, basically, subprojects are just projects that live within projects. They're nothing too crazy, but it's a really, really nice feature to have. Because when you have hundreds, if not thousands of sounds, you don't want them all living in just one project. You might want them kind of nested by categories. For example, you might have fireballs, you might have different types of spells, different actions, different weapons, and you might want to kind of categorize your projects so it's not all just one giant mess. So the way you can do that is to basically create what are known as subprojects. And basically they're just Reaper projects living within Reaper projects. But I'm going to show you an action that I actually really, really like that helps me set up these subprojects. So what I typed in is subproject up here, just in my actions menu. And there is a shortcut that I like called track, move tracks to subproject. And let me show you what this does first before I explain everything. So let me take this first sound, this kind of camera sound here. And I will just hit Control-Option-M, which is my shortcut for that. And you'll see that it kind of rendered for a second, and then it made this kind of purple region here. And you'll notice that there's no more waveform at all. And yours might be a little different. There are sub-project settings that I go into in my full playlist, but we'll go with this for now. But basically, it'll make kind of this region, this blank region that doesn't have any sound. Like if I hit play, nothing's happening. But what it did is, you notice up here, it opened a new tab. And this tab now contains that different file in it, that sound effect in it. So basically what it did was create a new project, put it in Reaper, and basically now when I double click this region, it is essentially like I'm double clicking on a new Reaper project, on a different Reaper project. And it'll open it up in a different tab. And now basically what I can do is I can have subprojects for everything. So let me make a new track, and I'll call this like Fireballs, let's say. Let's say this is where all my fireballs live. I can choose a region of time that I want the subproject to live. So let's say like highlight this much. I hit my shortcut, Control-Option-M. You'll see a new tab opens, and you'll see this is a new kind of fireballs project right here. Now let me get rid of these pesky little regions. And now, basically, I have this kind of sub-project where all my fireballs will live. And what I like to do is I actually like to have sub-projects. So for example, let's say this is my fireballs sub-project. Great. Now what I can do is just make tracks within here, and maybe I'll call this like Fireball Throw version 1. And then I'll call it like Fireball Explode version 1. And just the different actions that a fireball in a game could possibly do. And now what I can do, you guessed it, I can turn those into subprojects. So I can click one, highlight, move track to subproject, click another, move track to subproject, and I made these the same color. Let me change that. And basically, we now have two different projects, essentially, that are subprojects of Fireball, which is a subproject of this main one. So now I can work on version 1 of this Fireball throw, and I can export it, give it to my client, and maybe they're like, that's okay, but we want some changes. Well, instead of going into your original Fireball throw project and completely changing V1, you can just say Fireball throw V2, turn that into a new subproject, and now you can start working from here. Which is really nice, because then they might say, oh, you know what, we actually really liked version 1. Can you give this back to us? Or maybe make it a little bit different, but give it back to us. You can reference it, because you're making different versions as you go, as opposed to changing the original thing you made and then essentially losing all the work that you did, because who knows, you might go back to something and you might need it later, or you might repurpose something and use it for something else. But that's a super quick run through of Reaper. I know I didn't cover everything by any means, but hopefully this gets you up and running, and feel free to ask me any questions you have in the comments as well. And of course, watch the full playlist on Reaper for Game Audio if you want to get more into it and fill in any of those gaps. All right, I hope that was helpful. If you want to dive in deeper to Reaper, just make sure to watch that playlist on Reaper for Game Audio. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Go pet a dog.